Okay, so we have covered this before. This is just reintroducing it because it covers quadratic functions specifically. So we are talking about transformations. Okay, so what I tell my kids in class is anything outside the parentheses affects the y, which means in the vertical direction. Anything inside the parentheses affects the x, which is the horizontal direction, but I have to think of the opposite, and I'll explain that as I go. Okay, so here's a little format of what we're going to see. It won't be as advanced as this for every single problem, but we're going to break it down. So if the beginning coefficient is positive, then my parabola is going to open upward, okay? If the beginning coefficient is a negative, then it's going to open downward, but they refer to this as a reflection across the x-axis because it flips over the x-axis. So anytime there's a negative out in front, it's just a reflection across the x-axis, positive versus negative, okay? Then we talk specifically about the a value, okay? A value, whatever this is outside the parentheses, it affects the y. And it's either going to be a stretch or a compress, okay? So I like to think of a rubber band as I'm working through these. If this a value is bigger than 1, then it's going to be a vertical stretch, which means that the parabola is going to look really, really thin, okay? If the a value is less than 1, then it's going to be a vertical compress. That means instead of a stretch, it's going to be a push. It's going to get wider. So if it's greater than 1, then it's going to be thinner. If it is less than 1, then it's going to be wider. Stretch versus compress, okay? Then we look inside the parentheses, all right? Now, anytime I see inside the parentheses, I have to think the opposite, so it's really backwards there. If the value in front of the x is greater than 1, my mind wants to say that it's going to be a horizontal stretch, but it's the opposite. If it's greater than 1, then it's going to be a compress. So here, if the b value is greater than 1, it's going to be a horizontal compress because horizontal is anything with the x. So it's a horizontal compress, which means that the parabola is going to be thinner as well because I'm pushing in, okay? If the b value is less than 1, then I know in my mind I want to say it's a compress, but it's actually the opposite and it's going to be a stretch, okay? If it is a stretch, then that means my parabola is going to be wider, okay? And then, so it's opposite, it's going to be stretch. All right. We continue on with the c value. This is still inside the parentheses, so it's talking about the x. And if c, and so it's going to be a shift. It's either going to be a shift left or right. If it is a positive, then I have to think the opposite. In my mind, I think it's going to go to the right if it's positive. But it's actually going to do the opposite, and it's going to be to the left. Okay? So if this is positive c, it's actually going to move to the left. If this is negative c, then it's actually going to move to the right. Okay? So you got to think the opposite there. For the d value, okay, this is outside the parentheses, so it's talking about the y, which means an up and down direction. And I'm going to take it literal. So if it is a positive d, then it's going to go up. If it's negative d, then it's going to go down. Okay, so that was a broad review of it, but let's break it down. So the problems you're going to see today is tell me what happened to the problem. And we're going to read it from left to right, so we go nice and slow. All right. So if I look at my equation, my first equation, that leading coefficient is negative. That means it's going to open downward, okay? But they call that, so it's going to open down, but they call it a reflection across the x. So this would be a yes, okay? For vertical compress, vertical stretch. So the 3, it's outside the parentheses, and since it's bigger than 1, that means it's going to be a stretch. Okay, this one doesn't have a horizontal stretch or compress, so we can skip that. Then we move on to this minus 2. Minus 2 inside the parentheses, in my mind, tells me it's going to go to the left 2, but it's actually the opposite, and it's going to go to the right 2, okay? This negative 4 outside the parentheses, that's the vertical shift, and I take it literal. If it's negative 4, that means it's going to go down 4. Okay, so outside the parentheses, I take literally. If it's inside the parentheses, then I do the opposite. So now let's do number 2. Okay, so there is no negative. So is there a reflection? The answer would be no. Which way does it open? Since it's positive, it's going to go open up. Okay. Then we shift on over, and we have this plus 2 inside the parentheses. Since it is inside the parentheses, I have to think the opposite. So even though I want to say it's going to go to the right 2, it's actually the opposite, and it's going to go left 2. Sorry, I skipped a step. So this 1/2 out here, okay? So it's either a vertical stretch or a vertical compress. If it's greater than 1, then it's going to be a stretch. If it's less than 1, it's going to be a compress. So this one would be a compress. This positive 4 outside the parentheses, I'm going to take literal, and it's going to go be a shift up 4. All right, next. This negative outside the parentheses means it's going to open downward, which means it's a reflection. So this is a yes, and it's going to open down. The 23, so this is a stretch or compress. If it is bigger than 1, then that means it's going to be a stretch. If it's less than 1, then it's going to be a compress. Since 23 is bigger than 1, then it's going to be a stretch. Okay, sorry about that, my horrible handwriting. This minus 1 inside the parentheses, even though my mind wants to say it goes to the left 1, it's the opposite, and it's going to be to the right 1. This positive 4 outside the parentheses, it's a literal translation, so it's going to go up 4 as well. Okay, if we continue practicing, so this one does not have a negative in front, which makes it a positive, so it's going to open up, and since it opens up, it's not a reflection, so this would be a no for the reflection. The 1/5, it's either a stretch or a compress. If it's greater than 1, it's a stretch. If it's less than 1, it's a compress. So since it's less than 1, this would be a compress. This minus 6 inside the parentheses, in my mind, it wants to say go to the left. But since it is the opposite, it's actually going to go to the right 6. And this minus 7 outside the parentheses, since it's outside, we're talking about the y value. And we have to take it literal, so it means actually going down 7. Continuing on. This has a negative out in front. That means it's going to open downward, which they call a reflection. Oh, so this would be a yes for the reflection. Okay, the 3. Since it's outside the parentheses, it's either a stretch or a compress. If it's bigger than 1, it's a stretch. If it's less than 1, it's a compress. So since 3 is bigger than 1, it's a stretch. Minus 2 inside the parentheses, we have to think the opposite. So instead of going left 2, it's actually going to be right 2. And since outside the parentheses is plus 1, outside the parentheses is the y value, so that's up and down. And since it's positive 1, we're going to go up 1. Okay, so this is just more practice. This is exactly what you're going to see on your assignment, so it's good to know. This one right here, the negative outside in the front means it's going to open downward, which they call a reflection, so yes. The 1/4, since it is less than 1, is going to be a compress. The minus 1, since it's inside the parentheses, it's a left or right, and I have to think the opposite, so instead of left 1, it's going to be right 1. And this positive 4 outside the parentheses is up and down, and I take it literally, so it's going to be up 4. Okay, this one has less involved. It does not have a negative out in front, so it's going to open upward, which means it's not a reflection. It does not have a vertical stretch or compress because there's not a number outside the parentheses in the front. So this one does not apply. The plus 2 inside the parentheses, my mind wants to say goes to the right 2, but I have to think the opposite, so it's going to be left 2 this time. This minus 1 outside the parentheses is the y value, so up or down, and I have to take it literal, so it's going to go down 1. Okay, this one, it has a negative out in front, which means it's going to open downward, which they call a reflection. The 2 is bigger than 1, so it's going to be a stretch. The positive 5 inside, even though my mind wants to say it goes to the right 5, it's the opposite. It's going to go left 5. And then that's it for that one. So this one does not have anything after the parentheses, which means it does not have a translation up or down. Okay, this negative out in front means it's going to open downward, which they call a reflection. The 3/5 is less than 1, so it's going to be a compress. And then this minus 11 inside the parentheses, my mind wants to say left 11, but it's actually the opposite, so we're going to go right 11. This plus 6 outside the parentheses is the vertical translation, so it's either going to go up or down. In this case, we take it literal, so it's going to go up 6. Negative outside means it's going to go open downward, which they call a reflection. The 3 is bigger than 1, so it's going to be a stretch. The positive 1 inside the parentheses, my mind wants to say goes to the right 1, but it's actually going to be left 1. This minus 5 outside the parentheses, that's the vertical shift, and I take it literally, which means it's going to go down 5. A couple more. The negative in the front, which means it's going to open downward, which means it's going to be a reflection. The 1/7 is less than 1, so that means it's going to be a compress. The minus 5 inside the parentheses, my mind wants to say goes to the left, but it's the opposite. We're going to go to the right 5. The minus 2 outside the parentheses normally means, or is the vertical shift, and we're going to take it literally, so it's going to go down 2. And last but not least, this negative outside means it's going to open down, and that means it is a reflection. The 0.5 is less than 1, so we're going to do a compress. This positive 6 inside plus 6 means that normally I would go to the right 6, but it's actually going to be the opposite, so it's left 6. And the minus 3 outside the parentheses is a vertical shift, and I take it literally, so we're going to go down 3.